Good afternoon, I hope you're having an absolutely fantastic day. Now, last Wednesday, I spoke about how I produced my latest instrumental single, Switzerland, which will be linked down there if anyone wanted to hear it on Spotify, and there'll also be a link to that video up there somewhere as well if you wanted to see that. And I mentioned in that video that I'm not going to go through like the whole mixing process because it would take far too long and it needed a whole video of its own. So that's exactly what this video is going to be now. I'm going to talk about the mixing process for my track Switzerland. Quick note before I start, this is not me trying to give a tutorial or tell anyone how they should or shouldn't be mixing. You know, I'm not a professional mixing engineer. I try to put as much time and effort into learning to mix things as well as I can, but I'm not in any way professing to be some sort of expert or professional on this subject. I probably am doing things in this that are wrong or potentially frowned upon by other people. So firstly, I'm sorry if I'm doing that. And secondly, if you notice something in this video that I'm doing that seems completely wrong and terrible, then by all means let me know. You know, I'm always trying to learn how to do this better. But yeah, I thought I would give you a general overview of my mixing process and exactly what I did to create the track Switzerland. So yeah, let's get to the project. So this is the mix project for Switzerland. Now, as I mentioned last week, I always separate my mixing and my production files. So when I'm finished producing something, I export everything as individual stems with all of the effects bypassed and then bring them into a brand new project, start the whole thing with a clean slate, a fresh perspective, and hopefully fresh ears. The next hour or so of me mixing anything is getting everything organized properly. So as you can see here, it doesn't look like much. You know, this is the full project, but it's just, you know, one screen, but that's because I always put things into summing stacks. And there are two reasons for that. Firstly, it makes things neater, easier to find, better to look at, which just increases the general productivity of the workflow, I guess. And the second reason is that it means if you need to apply an effect to multiple different instruments, then you can do that really easily by just adding it onto the folder instead of the individual tracks. So this doesn't look like much. If I expand all of these folders, this is the contents of the whole production, and then the automation itself looks like this. So yeah, folders and organization are key, at least for me. Some people may be able to work in a messy mix file. I don't know anyone who does that, and I go a little bit overboard sometimes, I guess. I add, you know, individual icons for things that I want them for. I color coordinate it, although the color coordination in this project is pretty terrible. Not necessary, you don't have to do that. Although at the end of the day, anything that makes your workflow more effective and more smooth is worth doing. So, you know, if you find that making things really, really colorful and nice works for you, then do it. Next thing I do after organization and general housekeeping is create all of the auxiliary channels that I know I'll use. Now, this always starts off with like 2 or 3, and then by the end of the project, I've got about 8. But in this project, these are all of the sort of auxiliaries. So we've got things like echoes on drums, piano compression, a black hole reverb. Now, you don't have to necessarily do all of this, but I feel like if I know that I'm going to use certain things as auxiliaries, I'll set them up before I start mixing so that they're already there and I don't have to go through the hassle of creating them later on. So things like a room reverb, or it doesn't have to be a room reverb specifically, but a reverb, if you know that there are going to be various things that you want to be sent to a reverb channel, and not necessarily like a creative reverb, just a kind of gluing reverb, then it's good to have those things set up already, but it's not essential. You can always just do that as you go along. The next thing that I do is balance things. You know, before I start putting EQs on anything, applying compression anywhere, I get my levels right. So I'll go to the biggest, fullest, and loudest section of the track, kind of instrumentally and dynamically, and then I just play it, and immediately everything will be super, super loud and really obnoxious. So I tame all of the levels on every channel down to where they need to be, so that, I mean, obviously so that it's not clipping, but I try to get everything down so that the loudest section is peaking anywhere between -10 and -5 dB. Normally, I reckon I'd say I do that. Like, I don't have a chart for this. I just make sure that everything is balanced nicely and it's not getting too close to the red. Because the thing is it's always way easier to make stuff that's really quiet louder than it is to make stuff that's overly loud quieter. And you don't want to get used too early on to hearing things sounding massive and full, because the whole point of mixing is that you're sculpting it to sound like that. And if you start off with everything being really, really loud, then for me anyway, it can result in me not thinking as clearly about what I actually want to do with the mix and how I'm going to get it to that point. I'm just kind of like, oh, it's loud, therefore it's good. So I get my levels right, and only then do I start actually sculpting the sound of the mix. And when I'm at that point is when I'll go to the beginning of the track and just kind of play through it, changing things as I go along. So the first thing that I would have looked at was the ambience that starts the track off. So this is the ambience. I know there are a couple of piano notes in there as well, but I put them into the ambience folder just because they aren't really playing anything obviously melodic. They're just there to reinforce certain things. So this is like the main ambience. As you can see, I've done very little to it. All I've done is take out pretty much all of the low ends and then chucked Echo Boy on there with spaced space echo, which is one of my favorite of the delays that you've got in there. Echo Boy is a fantastic delay unit if you're thinking of getting one. So that's just the regular sound of that kind of string Evo pad thing that's going on. But I took out all the low end, which makes it sound like this. And then the delay just pushes it back ever so slightly more. So if you have a listen to this now. Just with it off, just with it on. It just makes it a bit wider, a bit smoother, and not right in the middle of the stereo field. The other ambience at the beginning of this track is this one. The pumping one that I mentioned before. To achieve the pump, I've literally just got one knob pumper at a very kind of low rate. If you get rid of that and you just keep it as a constant, then there's no difference between that and this one. So I wanted there to be a little bit more of a kind of flow, and that obviously sits well with these piano notes. Now these are all really, really tiny details that don't really matter that much, I suppose, but yeah, so those are the ambiences, and then the next thing I would have done would have been look at the pianos. Now, I love using soft felt pianos, but the problem with them is it can be quite difficult to mix them into something. You want to be very careful EQing a piano because there's so much harmonic content in there. If you take out something that on one note sounds like it's a little bit too resonant or whatever, then that will affect so much more of the rest of the instrument. But to get soft, delicate felt pianos to still retain that sort of feeling, but be a lot more present, there are like two things I do. First thing is parallel compress them. So this first auxiliary channel here is just got an 1176 emulation there, which is compressing pretty hard. But that's blended with the other sounds. So if I then play it without it, and then with, it just helps sustain it and help it cut through. One thing that you always need to be careful of though when you're mixing is not confusing louder with better. If you think something sounds better, but it's also making it louder, bring the levels down so that they're level matched and then listen to it and try and establish if it does actually sound better or if it just sounded better to you because it was more audible. So that's the first auxiliary, just classic parallel compression. And then the second one is a black hole reverb, which I've said before, I absolutely love it, but I've got it sent to that more than some people might. I like reverbs, and this is a very kind of ethereal, ambient, dreamy track, so you can get away with it a bit more. But one thing you need to be very careful of with regards to reverb is that you're cutting out the low end of it, because you don't need all of that like rumbly stuff underneath muddying up in reverb that's just tailing on for a long time, so just cut that all out. So if we listen to some of the piano with and without the reverb, so that's with, it's without. So it's a lot of reverb, but I think it was appropriate for this track. The only EQ I did to that piano was taking a little bit out of 132, yeah, around that area, so between 100 and, I don't know, 230 hertz. A lot of felt pianos and soft pianos have an issue with rumble and just like muddying frequencies. So the Olaf Arnold's piano, which is one that I use a lot as well, has got an issue there. So it's just easy, just take a little bit out of that. But always trust your ears, that's the main thing. You know, don't do something just because you think it's the right thing to do. Try it, and if it actually makes it sound better, then keep it. If it doesn't, but you're just doing it for the sake of it, then maybe think about whether or not it's needed. So speaking of that kind of troubled frequency area within the pianos that I use, you don't always have to get rid of it. So in the earlier bits, you can take it down a little bit, but as you can see with this piano section here, I take it down more when it's a fuller section of the track, when there's more going on, because there are more instruments to kind of be competing in that frequency range. So this piano track is also doing chords in a lower register, so I had to do a bit more EQing anyway. Not that I did much, yeah, it's just a very similar dip there, 160 hertz there, and I took all of the low end out of it, because when it's actually playing the lower stuff, then that's much more of a concern. But you can see here that I've automated it here from -3 dB on that, which is peak 1, down to -6.5. And that's because of that section of the music, it gets bigger and there are more instruments filling out that space. So as you can see here, it'll dip down. If I take that EQ off completely, just cleans it up a little bit. Let's have a look at some of the other elements here. Now, strings, like I said before, are my favorite thing to program. And in this, we've got two sections, solo strings and ensemble strings. Ensemble strings sounding like this. Solo strings sounding like this. I find that in my never-ending quest to make really nice strings, what often works to make something sound full is blending an ensemble section with a soloist, because it just adds a bit of realism to it all. But yeah, together. They need to be together. So with strings, I often EQ them with Pultex, as I've done here, just doing small changes here and there, like nothing crazily drastic. I've just tried to boost the lower end a bit, make it a bit more full, as well as boosting a little bit of the brightness. So if you listen to it without that EQ, and then with the EQ, it's a bit louder. So if we take it down by about 3 dB, listen to it then. So see, it's a little bit too thin, you know? The other thing that's important to do with things like strings, if they're playing an expressive line, is to just have them ride the fader a bit. So on the solo cello, when that first comes in, this. So in addition to automating the dynamics using the modulation ribbon on my keyboard when I'm doing it, when I'm mixing it, I also do stuff like this. And this is very minimal. Sometimes I'll go into massive detail with things, but that just means that certain notes that you want to fade down a bit can. So simple things like that. I mean, what you find when you're mixing often is the case is just that it's like making the tiniest, what seem like insignificant changes all the time. But when you make enough tiny little changes, then you have a general impact on how the whole thing sounds. You know, I'm always scared when I start mixing something, but I get into this mindset where it's like I'm carving a statue. You know, you're not just going to do it quickly. It's going to take lots of small bits of work. I always think of myself as just chipping away at something. So I'll mix something for a couple of days. Each time I sit down, I might be struggling and not knowing exactly what to do, but you know, I'll make a couple of tiny changes and then a couple more tiny changes, and then I'll be like, oh, actually, yeah, this is better. Knowing full well that there's still loads more to do, but it's just about gradually, you know, smashing away at it, keep going, and kind of trying to trust your ears a little bit as well. Now, the percussion, which is one of the elements I spent the most time on in this track, has got a fair amount going on. So I've got my main percussion and my book percussion. These are also being sent to an auxiliary for compression, a completely different compression channel to the ones that the pianos are going to. You know, you want to create auxiliaries, but you don't want to send everything to just one, because there'll be completely different compression settings for the different types of thing you'll be doing. But anyway, so it's going to that, and it's also going to a reverb. Interesting story about this track actually is that I exported, I think, 8 final mixes for it, and I kept thinking that something was wrong, and I realized what it was before exporting the final one. Like, I'd literally even submitted it to the distribution networks before listening to it again and realizing this mistake and then deleting it and uploading it again. I hadn't put any reverb on the percussion. Again, when I say reverb, I don't mean, you know, a creative long modulating reverb or anything like that, but you want reverb that will just help glue things together and make it sound more realistic. I think a lot of mistakes that people make when they're mixing something that's like electronic-y or kind of has got elements of electronica and weird ambient percussion is that they keep the percussion really dry, because you want to be able to hear what it's doing. But that usually ends up in things sounding a bit static and sounding a bit kind of unnatural. If you're listening to a totally electronic track, you still want it to sound real in a way. Like, you don't want it to sound so digital and so kind of processed that that's going to be an issue. So yeah, chuck reverb on your percussion through an auxiliary, and not overly aggressive reverb. I just remember the book percussion is where this was the problem, not with the main percussion. So this was the very last thing I did before I exported it. And as you can see here, I've got a Valhalla vintage verb there with just a plate reverb, 1.17 seconds of decay, and not very much of it at all. But I've low cut all of the filth out of the bottom end. But if you listen to this without the reverb, And then with the reverb, it's affecting it, but it's making it sound more uniform. You're not hearing things randomly sticking out in the way that you do when it's like this. If I get rid of the low cut on that reverb, you'll hear a little bit more about what I mean about the muddiness. So tiny difference. You may or may not be able to hear it, but yeah, these things are important. So when the percussion first comes in, there's a big filter on it, which gradually opens up as the piece gets towards its sort of climax. And to do that, I did something incredibly lazy, but I just used a plugin called One Knob Filter, which looks like that, and automated the filter amount, getting rid of any of the resonance. So that's the automation line there. As you can see, it gets just up to that point right before everything starts. And if we listen to how that sounds, and then at the very end of it, the book percussion has the same thing happening, but it's very, very minimal because it's just on these little page turn things here. So in the bass side of things, I have a sub bass track and a synth bass at the end. The synth bass has got some of the bass cut out at the bottom there, as you can see. That's because the sub bass is what's going to be helping to drive that along. So the bass by itself just sounds like this. Pretty standard stuff, but then to beef it out, add the sub bass in there. Then without, with. Hopefully your headphones or speakers are good enough to hear the difference there. Also, at the very end of this track, one of the things that I did was filter the piano as it's kind of closing. I wanted to make it definitely feel like this was kind of all coming to an end and kind of just winding down a bit, I guess. So there's a whole load of filtering going on here, all with just the standard channel EQ. So as you can see here, the high cut is just gradually tailing off like so, alongside the volume coming down towards the ends, as well as the peak 1 gain and the peak 1 Q factor being automated. It says peak 4 Q factor, that is doing absolutely nothing. So the gain of peak 1, which is this one here, that's going to be coming down. So it's going to be gradually bringing that down, removing more and more of the kind of tiresome, unpleasant lower frequencies that I don't like. And while that's going on, the Q factor is also increasing. So it'll be widening that out. So it'll be removing even more. When that's all put together, it sounds just like this. That was never as smooth as I wanted. I kind of should have spent a bit more time going through that and finding the absolute perfect ratios of everything, because it still feels a little bit jarring to me when I listen to it. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of close things off nicely. There's not a whole lot more that I feel like I can really discuss without it getting boring. I mean, so all of the synths here, you know, each one of these has got EQs and echo boys all over them to kind of make them, you know, slam around a bit. And then the sample library vocal kind of ahs and oohs here, we've got a whole load of reverb on them, obviously, as well as a bit of compression. I also rode the fader on them a little bit, but not really very much. So if we listen to what these sound like. So this is without any of the effects. And with. I feel like that's all I can really talk about with regards to the mixing of this track without it becoming super boring, just going through every single plugin chain, which is just, it's also kind of irrelevant because like Every plugin chain will be different, and there are different reasons to do different things depending on the song that you're working on or what you want it to sound like. Those are all of the like important things, I guess. Although actually no, so the plugin chain that I have on like the master bus as well, I'll show you that. What I do when I get my mix to like a version 1, add the plugin chain and then start mixing into it. I always have pretty much exactly the same chain and will change it from track to track based on what I think it needs. But you know, so just an EQ, I just trim the very top and the very bottom off to make sure that there's nothing grimy going on that I can't necessarily hear. SSL compressor is like the iconic standard glue that you have for everything really. You don't want there to be more than about 4 dB of gain reduction going on there. Pultec EQ with a low end trick going on. Imager, widen things out a bit, and then you got your limiter at the ends. So that's the chain on my master bus. I normally then don't export it and master it further. I get the settings I want from that, unless I'm doing more than one track that are being released at the same time. So like with the Her EP, I mastered them separately, because one of the main things with mastering is you want each track to kind of sound uniform. You want the levels to be matched on each one so that you don't have one track that's, you know, peaking at minus 0.4 dB and then the other one is like way quieter than that. Mastering is a tricky thing to tackle. Professional mastering engineers will have loads of equipment and knowledge that you won't. So like if you can afford to get something properly mastered, then you might as well do it. But realistically, as long as you can understand, you know, how and why to use a plugin chain like that, reference it to other tracks. That's another important thing actually I didn't mention. You know, always have reference tracks. I always have my production file in here as well as reference tracks if I use reference tracks, so that I can listen to the difference between what my production file sounded like and the finished mix and kind of note how the progression has gone. And you always start off feeling like, oh, it's never going to sound as good as it did when I was producing it. And then very quickly you realize, wait, this sounds way better than my horrible, muddy, drenched in reverb production files. But yeah, mastering and all that kind of stuff I don't really want to get into. Just make sure that before it's hitting any of this stuff, before we start putting any of that on there, your levels are okay so that the signal isn't too hot going in that direction. So the climax of this track before it goes through any of the master bus chains sounds like this. 3.5 dB of headroom, pretty acceptable as far as I'm concerned. And then compare that to this. Makes a big difference, but it's also really important not to throw a load of shit onto your master bus that makes it sound better, like, you know, the whole meme of the Fruity Loops sound goodizer. Yeah, don't do that. Make it sound as balanced and as good as you can without any of that stuff, and then use that to kind of further sculpt it into a kind of final form. It's like the varnish that you'd put on a table that you've just made. You know, if you've done a really crappy job, you used terrible wood and bad jointing to create a really, really rubbish dining room table, then it doesn't matter what gloss you put on it, it's still gonna look like shit. Same with this, you know, if you've got a terrible mix and you haven't put any time into it, but you've put like the Greg Wells Mix-centric plugin on it and just turned that up to 7, then it's not really going to be adequate. Anyway, who am I to make judgments? I'm shit. So there we go, that is how I mixed Switzerland. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not trying to tutor anyone. I'm aware that I'm probably doing lots of very amateur things and very silly things probably in my mixing, but I'm just showing you what I did because some of you have expressed some interest. So, you know, if you're a mixing engineer and you're watching this and you're noticing something that I'm doing that's terribly wrong, let me know down in the comment section for sure. So yeah, that's everything. Links in the description to the song if you wanted to hear it, as well as links to my EP Her on vinyl and iTunes and Spotify and all of that stuff, and my socials and all of that down there as well. I'm thinking of doing next Wednesday a how I produced Her track, so if you wanted to see that, let me know so I can actually make it. But yeah, not the whole EP, just the track Her, because it's massive. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you very soon.